All right, good morning. Hi, I'm Christina Hochul, as Mike said, and I lead our Strategic Alliance Development function at Alexion, AstraZeneca's Rare Disease Business Unit. So welcome. We're going to start out this morning talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and what it means for rare diseases and rare disease patients. And so, we know that President Biden passed, the Inflation Reduction passed and was one of President Biden's really signature pieces of legislation. And it contains a lot of really good pieces and policies for Americans. So capping the out-of-pocket costs for insulin at $35 a month. The other out-of-pocket cost for prescription drugs is capped at $2,000, and you can pay it over a plan year. But today we're really going to focus on the orphan drug exclusion as part of the negotiation process. And this specific narrow provision is really slowed and in some cases really stopped drug development in the rare disease space. And this is why it's really concerning. There's just a lot of unmet need in the rare disease community. We know that 95% of rare diseases do not have an FDA approved therapy, and there are over 10,000 rare diseases. And so this makes continued research and development really important to our space and our community. And unfortunately, when CMS issued guidance around the law, they further disincentivize manufacturers from seeking even that second indication because of their interpretation. So today, the panelists and I are going to really talk about this pressing policy challenge and even a potential legislative solution that we have. So I would like to begin by asking each of the panelists to introduce yourself or your organization. And kind of a question to all of you to get this started is, how did you get involved in rare disease policy? So go to Jennifer.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Snow. I am currently running Apteka. It's a health policy consulting firm focused on pharmaceuticals, but I've been involved in the pharmaceutical policy space for a number of years. And I really like the question. It's one that I don't think I've ever talked about. My mom had a rare disease when I was growing up, and I remember looking at the Merck medical manual and seeing just a small mention of it and feeling so seen. I mean, it was it was literally like one line about the disease, but it was like it existed somewhere. And I think she has since passed, and there wasn't great treatment for her, but I think the hope of it, her and I would talk about treatments, and every once in a while I'd be seated at a table at a conference with somebody who had, once I sat next to a chief medical officer from a company that had a drug in trials for it. It's like, so how's that going? And you know what I mean? And her and I would talk about it. And I think just that hope of it, and I'm really inspired by that to keep working in this space.
Thanks. Amy Comstock-Rick. I'm a principal at Leavitt Partners. My background in health policy is for 11 years. I was the CEO of the Parkinson's Action Network, an advocacy and health policy organization. And then for 8 years, I was the CEO of the Food and Drug Law Institute, which focused on all legal and regulatory issues over which FDA has jurisdiction, which is quite a big bucket, actually. In terms of rare disease, while Parkinson's is not a rare disease, there are some Parkinsonisms that are rare. But the world of health policy is so driven by incentives, and the research and development pipeline is huge, and the rare disease community is just a part of that. And we need to make sure, and really all the research we do can benefit. It can be unexpected sometimes that research can benefit a rare disease, or research for a particular rare disease turns out to have general applicability. So I don't really divide them. I think, though, that the statistic that you mentioned, Christina, about 95% of people with rare diseases don't have an FDA-approved treatment, that has to change. And we're here to talk about not making it worse, but making it better.
I can't tell. Is this working? Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, clearly my technology skills are a big asset I bring to the table. Hi, I'm Conor Sheehy. I'm a senior health policy advisor with the minority staff of the Senate Finance Committee, and I handle prescription drug policy as well as Medicare Part B, more generally, and Medicare Part D. I became interested in rare disease policy when I started in my previous role on the Hill with Senator Tim Scott, who was the co-chair of the Sickle Cell Disease Caucus. And I have to say, sickle cell disease probably affects somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 Americans. And so, relatively speaking, it's one of the larger rare diseases and one that does generate more attention on Capitol Hill and frankly, more attention from an R&D standpoint just by virtue of the fact that there's been pretty innovative research with respect to some of the biomarkers. We've seen a lot of work on gene and cell therapies, particularly with respect to sickle cell and beta thal, just because oftentimes we see a lot of overlap in terms of useful treatments. And I think that's something that we'll get into a little bit today, just because it is a real concern with respect to some of the legislation and policy we've seen in more recent years. But candidly, I think the most eye-opening thing for me as someone who did not grow up studying healthcare policy was when I would meet with patient organizations or with patients who would say their disease population was 10 in the United States, or their disease population that was known was 3. And generally when I would talk to these folks, the experience of even getting that diagnosis oftentimes required them to visit facilities across 5, 6, 7 states, a number of different specialists. It required them to receive a lot of misdiagnoses, including from really good faith clinicians. It's not a knock against medical professionals, but to me, that was a part of the landscape that was never visible. And I think that's frankly something that's a real hurdle for advocacy with respect to Capitol Hill and CMS, just because, and frankly, I'm so impressed with a lot of the coalitions that have come together with respect to rare and ultra rare diseases, because you can help to fill and bridge that gap. But it is, I can't imagine being in a situation where I'm one of 3 known patients across the country, where some of the top researchers and clinicians in the world are saying, we're not sure what your prognosis looks like. You know, maybe this will work. It has a 5% chance. That would actually be good based on some of the folks I've talked to. That is at least optimistic. But I love what both of my co-panelists have said thus far about the gap, but also the sense of hope. And I think taking on my role with committee, it's been incredibly exciting to see the opportunities we have within our massive federal healthcare programs to try to build and improve upon some of the incentives that you talked about. I also think there are 2 sides to every coin. And over the past few years, I think we've seen both sides of that coin. I think we have a lot of reason for optimism based on 2023 and some of the positive conversation and bipartisan discussion we've seen, both with respect to components of the IRA and with respect to issues like pharmacy benefit manager reform and supply chain reform, which can actually create pull incentives and patient relief simultaneously. And I do think that's something I want to underscore. But I think, as we'll get into, it was disappointing to me during the Inflation Reduction Act process to see a lot of really well-intentioned, really smart folks who worked on the drafting of that legislation, I feel create certain gaps in certain areas where unintended consequences seemed evident even then, and I think seem even more glaring now. And so again, I think looking at both sides of that coin is going to be incredibly important and challenging, but I do think there is still a lot of reason for hope and optimism as this year has progressed. I felt that way even more so. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate today.
Yeah, no, thank you all. And thank you just for adding in your personal stories and touches. I think that's what's so great about the rare disease community. You really never know what challenges of people faced, and the ability for us kind of to come together to work on policy issues has been really great. So I know the panel is on the Inflation Reduction Act, but we're going to take a step back 40 years and talk a little bit about what Congress was thinking with the Orphan Drug Act and how they established some of these incentives. And so can you tell us, Jennifer, a little bit about prior to the ODA and then kind of get into post-ODA?
Sure. So it's interesting to kind of go back in time and say, you know, late 70s, we finally started to have some pharmaceutical advancements in more general population treatments. but you had individuals with rare disease with very few treatment options. And so people with Gaucher's, Tourette's, Huntington's, and other disorders got together and they formed a coalition, coalitions being important, the National Organization for Rare Diseases, NORD, which led in 1993 to the enactment of the Orphan Drug Act. And so if you look backwards, prior to the enactment of the Orphan Drug Act, you had less than 40 approved treatments to treat rare disease. And so, I mean, you look ahead to now and you can see like it made a difference.
No, it definitely made a difference. And I think now, as we've seen, so that we just celebrated earlier this year the 40th anniversary of the ODA, and that really, to Jennifer's point, has put the incentives in place. That was a community with a lot of unmet need, and now we've seen a lot more therapies right in this space. So now we have, 40 years later, we have, almost 600 therapies, still a lot of unmet need. But I'd like to turn this over to Conor. So, I know you alluded this a little bit in your intro about what Congress was thinking around the Inflation Reduction Act and the negotiation program and kind of how all this came to place from your perspective on the Hill.
Yeah, it's a great question because I do think it's worth noting this was very evident to those of us who had to keep reading and rereading new text as it would come out over the course of a couple-year period. But prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, we had seen come out of the House of Representatives the Build Back Better Act, or BBBA. This was legislation that would have imposed the drug price negotiation program that's sort of the hallmark of the IRA, although I totally agree with you, Christina. There are things in the IRA we really like as well. I always want to underscore that, the $2,000 out-of-pocket cap, the monthly smoothing. I think those are game-changing and good for patients. But with respect to BBBA, you saw a really massive drug price negotiation program that created a lot of concerns, even among a lot of Democrat members who were very skeptical of some of the pricing trends in the market. But this program would have applied across commercial, Medicare, virtually all programs. It incorporated international pricing, which raised a lot of concerns. And I think one of the key issues that I even heard from some of my moderate Democrat colleagues was there were really no exceptions at all.
Right.
It was an incredibly broad-based piece of legislation, and you heard a number of members in the House express reservations about that version. I think Scott Peters got a lot of blowback, I know, from some activist groups who felt that he was shilling with or siding with Big Pharma. But if you listen to what a lot of Representative Peters said, he was pointing to concerns like these ones. He was saying, is there not a way to try to scale this program back such that we're able to preserve incentives for innovation while also improving prescription drug affordability? As the legislation moved over to the Senate and went through a number of different makeovers, we saw a few key changes, I think two of which are relevant here. Number one, there had been a tax included in the House bill that would have said, with respect to the Orphan Drug Act's tax incentives, I believe, if I remember correctly, you would have only been able to get credit for a single indication. So it was actually parallel to what we ended up seeing in the orphan drug exclusion. But frankly, the orphan tax policies have always been incredibly bipartisan in the Senate. I think the House is its own world. I don't want to call them the JV team or disrespect their great camaraderie and wonderful energy levels. But I do think it's worth noting the Senate has always been a more bipartisan place. And I think a number of members said, we want to take this off the table. You had folks like Senator Carper, who had been a longstanding champion and said, I think this is a no-go. So fortunately, that was removed. With respect to the orphan drug exclusion, the goal of this provision, as I understand it, and I've sat on panels with Anna Kaltenbach, who is a very smart person and has, I think, really good intentions with respect to this landscape. But I remember when we were debating this legislation through this reconciliation process, which is essentially a mechanism that allows you to move legislation without 60 votes in the Senate. And as a result, there are certain rules. There is an enforcement process with respect to those rules. But as it was characterized at the time, this was a goal to try to protect incentives for orphan drug research and development by insulating certain orphan drug products from this negotiation program under the assumption that these are different products. They have a wildly different set of economic needs and circumstances. These are generally drugs that have different pricing considerations in mind, just because, we've even seen ICER, which generally comes down in a pretty condemnatory way around virtually every price of every drug on the market. They've acknowledged with respect to certain rare disease treatments that sometimes you're going to be looking at a reasonable top line of $1 million or more just by virtue of the patient population, the payer mix, and all these challenges. So I think the intention there was shared on both sides. There was bipartisan interest in ensuring that we could protect orphan drugs from a scheme that just was not a fit for these products. I have all sorts of issues with the scheme with respect to other products too, but this was an area of common ground. I do think what we saw was after that agreement on this concept, I think we saw a drafting issue that was technical and that Christina referenced earlier, which is that I think a provision that was meant to capture orphan drugs with one orphan indication, and that was their only indication, was essentially read back under this revised guidance to apply only to one orphan designation. And essentially, from an R&D standpoint, this meant you couldn't even really set multiple targets for your R&D program and for these clinical programs because the immediate receipt of a second designation, even if there was no FDA approval to go along with it, would immediately trigger an end to your insulation from this program. So I personally think that piece was a technical issue, and it's consistent with my understanding from the Congressional Budget Office and from the drafters. The other issue was, I think in an effort to try to deter and combat gaming, this provision was drafted with the intent of capturing only products that had one approved orphan indication. Now, the challenge here is you essentially set up a deterrent for research into even a second or third orphan-specific indication. So the examples that I've heard cited by folks who have defended this really limited scope and this limited exclusion, they point to products like Humira. And they say, oh, well, Humira's had an orphan indication or two. The issue is you have a ton of products that are orphan disease treatments only and that have multiple orphan disease treatment indications. I think if I remember correctly, even if you're looking just at orphan-only products, it's 1/5 or more have successfully received approval for second or third or fifth in some cases orphan indications. So that was one big issue, was you were throwing the baby out with the bathwater, where you essentially meant to target manufacturers who are trying to game this scheme by, waiting on a breast cancer indication you knew you were going to get with a blockbuster status by leaning in on this exclusion that you got for another separate orphan indication. So I think that was one issue. I think the second issue was the text was ambiguous about when the clock should start. So under the IRA, if you're a small molecule, you cannot have one of these negotiated prices take effect until 9 years after approval. So I will say you're effectively cutting the patent life short by 4 or 5 years on average for small molecule drugs. And for biologics, it's 13 years. That is closer to the effective patent life, although what we've seen with biologic products is you're often looking at 16, 17, or 18 years, so you still are taking a haircut in terms of effective patent life before erosion. The problem with the orphan drug exclusion as it's currently designed is, as it's currently being interpreted is, the second that you get a second indication, even if it's for another really rare disease, you lose that protection overnight. So essentially, you could be subject to that program the next day, depending on when your first FDA approval was. And I think that issue of the clock starting as early as it does and sort of retroactively stripping away that exclusion, I've heard as many concerns about that piece from both the biotechnology community, and I should note a lot of these companies, as you all know, are small startups. They're preclinical, pre-commercial. But I also think it's worth noting that from the standpoint of the investors who make all of this innovation possible, recognizing that the NIH is never going to substitute the private market, you create a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the investment ecosystem when you set up this sort of a scheme where folks aren't sure, will this product be insulated, especially when the House Democrat leads have said, we want to expand this to virtually every drug across every market. So I think in terms of the origins here, there are elements where I have a respectful disagreement, and I think there are elements where a more robust legislative process that was more bipartisan probably could have helped to work through some of the technical components. But here we are now, and hopefully we can find a way forward, recognizing that I don't think anyone wants to see innovation dry up in a space where, again, 95% of the currently known rare diseases lack treatments, and I'd imagine probably thousands more we don't even know of right now.
No, definitely. I think that was really helpful, Conor, giving us all the background and talking about the different provisions and the conversations that were occurring on Capitol Hill. So taking a little bit of a step kind of back, Jennifer, can you talk us a little bit about the negotiation process, how it's going with CMS, kind of, what is currently going on, as we're seeing it unfold?
Sure. So starting in, is that on? So starting in early September, they announced the 10 drugs that will be negotiated for 2026. But in terms of background, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, directs the Medicare program to select drugs for price negotiation by gross Medicare spending. And you referred to kind of like what's eligible, what's not. So you've got the small molecule drugs that have been approved for at least 7 years at the time of selection. So small molecule are only 7 years. Biologics that have been approved for at least 11 years at the time of selection. So you have a gap there, which I think we should talk about later. And products that have no approved or marketed generic or biosimilar. So those are kind of what CMS is looking at in terms of negotiation. They did include the exclusions, orphan drugs with a single indication, drugs that are a small manufacturer's only major product, drugs with Medicare spending less than $200 million a year, and all plasma-related products. So there are kind of these gaps, but it's not enough. I think, as we've talked about, there's different ways to read that, and I think some small tweaks, and we're getting there. I mean, there's ways I would blow it all up, but that's not what we're here for today. That's a cocktail hour probably conversation.
And kind of getting back to your piece about the small molecules versus kind of the biologics, I want to kind of ask, Amy to kind of step in here and kind of talk about, how does that affect like patient access,
Well, what we're really, my turn to struggle. What we're really talking about here is the incentives and the shifting of incentives that has occurred as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act drug price negotiation program. We need a short term for that. In terms of rare disease, everything about the drug development, as I said earlier, is about incentives. And I want to lay on the table, if I can start with this, a story that I heard Frank Sosnowski tell at a previous Hill briefing, that the Orphan Drug Act was passed in 1983, and he was tapped as a younger attorney then to be at FDA to lead the new Orphan Drug Act program office. And he opened it and was all excited and waited for people to come in, and nobody showed up. Because at the time, I had never heard this story before, at the time of passage, the Orphan Drug Act required that a patent had not been filed on that product. So there was no incentive really for the development of those treatments and drugs. And so what was the point of passage, quite frankly? So a tweak was made to shift the incentives that patented products were eligible for the Orphan Drug Act. And we all know the result now, which are the impressive numbers that Christina and Jennifer have talked about. So this will not be the first time that legislation is tweaked, because after passage, we learned that incentives were misaligned. So that's really what we're talking about now. So I think my colleagues have laid it out pretty well, but the incentives really need to shift back, not new incentives, but shift back to what they've been for 40 years, because the Inflation Reduction Act program really undermines, it doesn't technically change the Orphan Drug Act, but it really undermines the incentives that have worked so well. So do you want me to go into solutions now, or I don't want to mess with your, I won't.
I think I was going to go kind of ask Conor, because I know you alluded to some of this in the investor space, but, what have we seen? The legislation, it passed and it became law almost a year ago. So what's happening now? Like, how are investors thinking of it? What have we kind of seen in this space, in the rare disease space, post-IRA?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I think we're getting new data points every day, and so far it's been incredibly concerning. I think those of us who were worried about what we would see under the IRA, I think have had a lot of those fears validated. I know there are a number of initiatives. I think the Incubate Coalition has one that actually track different stories as they come out, but we've seen a number of rare disease treatment candidates and trials that have been pulled. And again, there are all sorts of reasons that things can get pulled, but this has been a factor that's been consistently cited. And I would also flag, because I know this is a talking point that I've heard from some folks that I think warrants a response. Some folks have said, oh, they're just blaming the IRA for decisions they would have made anyway. Candidly, a lot of the context where we're seeing the IRA come up, it would actually be illegal, or they could get in very significant trouble with investors and shareholders for them to be dishonest or misleading about this. And behind the scenes, in non-publicly available documents, they do actually have to justify some of those types of statements. So I will say, I don't think this is pearl clutching, and it's certainly not pearl clutching in the sense that we are in fact seeing plugs pulled. Sorry.
No, say it's a matter of math. If
Right.
do the math, it just doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
To pursue additional, the timing and everything, it just doesn't make sense.
It's totally right. And I will say, I've talked to a number of CEOs who would love nothing more than to launch clinical programs on second rare indications, I should say, and who, if it were up to them, in some cases say, I'd be willing to go for this and take my chances, even with the IRA. Their investors and their shareholders are saying no, and they're not doing so irrationally. I think that the biggest concern that I've heard, and candidly, I've heard this from friends who are in financial services world and with whom I had never had conversations about health policy before at their request and or demand. But these folks are now saying to me, and some are in California and some are in New York, but the perception in finance world is not of a static policy. So I think a lot of these folks, they don't look at the legislation that's on the ground and say, okay, current law, this is how it's always going to be. First off, they expect, consistent with historical programs we've set up under all of the entitlements, that the program scope will get bigger. It will never get significantly smaller. So there's an expectation, for instance, that these price points, either by way of law or by way of insurer practices, will end up expanding far beyond the scope of Medicare and Medicaid, where there already is an automatic trigger under the legislation, or 340B, where there's an automatic trigger under the legislation. So you actually already see direct movement into the commercial market. That makes folks very uncomfortable. The other piece of this is the program's inherently cumulative. This was not understood by everyone that we talked to at the time of enactment, but the reality is every year for the next few years, the secretary will list more and more drugs. Now, those lists are cumulative. So you get added in a given year, your price control or negotiated price takes effect 2 years after your selection, and you're subject to this program until a generic or biosimilar alternative comes to market. And just to be entirely candid, at that point, it doesn't matter much from an ROI standpoint because you're gonna lose market share and you're gonna see massive price erosion regardless, even if the IRA prices were sustainable. And candidly, there are statutory ceilings set under the law such that within the first 2 decades of your initial FDA approval, you are capped at, I think it's a 60% discount from the pricing benchmark they use at the start. And again, that's the ceiling. So I think one of the pieces that's concerning is the scope will organically get bigger. There's an expectation that via legislation over time, especially as folks look for cost savings opportunities, the legislation itself will expand and that it's going to have all these organic effects. And on top of all that, there's no certainty as to what price you're going to get. These are not reviewable decisions. Once the secretary sets the price, you're precluded from any administrative or judicial review. There's no sort of a provision for an arbitration or independent dispute resolution process with respect to that price point. And candidly, they will be able to renegotiate that price at any point on some bases where they're saying, oh, we might go higher, and on a number of bases where they might actually go significantly lower. The last piece I would say on that component in particular is, with all this in mind, if you're an investor and you're considering this potentially game-changing products clinical development program into a second or third indication, you have to look at this system and say, okay, there's a good chance that it will capture virtually any product that's not in one of these exclusions squarely. You have to look at, okay, there's really no guardrail for what the price might be. And just to put a finer point on it, whether you look 5 years, 10 years out in the future and you envision you have someone like a President Trump who proposed international price indexing, which would be incredibly volatile in this space. President Biden, which I think, we don't know where this administration is going to go, or President Warren or Sanders. We don't have any idea what administration will be in place down the line at any given point when your product is priced, and there are no guardrails or checks on that administration. So I think what you've seen is a process that from an investor's and frankly from a biotech entrepreneur's standpoint is ultimately going to be subject to political whims. I look at the current political ecosystem and the volatility. I watch any scenes from the floors of the House or increasingly over the course of the past few days of Senate committees, and I would get very skittish about the prospect of turning over those sorts of decision makings with no floor over to the whims of where the American political system may or may not be in 10 years.
Can I add one other incentives piece too, which is it's not just develop or not develop the drug for a rare disease, it's the order in which you would put them on the market. So if you get the 9 years for a small molecule, 7 before you're put on the list, you will want to get the full benefit of that time period. So the incentive is either for the first approval to be for a larger rare disease, or even not for a rare disease at all, to get the full benefit of your 7/9 years. And then if you've known all that time, there's great potential for a rare disease or a smaller rare disease to hold that till the end. And back to where Christina started, that is not okay for the 95% of people with rare diseases that we might know a drug has benefit, or potential benefit, I should say. And it gets sat on to get the full financial incentives, which drug companies need to make money too, to keep doing what they're doing. I don't have a problem with that.
No, I believe Genentech has already said that that's exactly what they're doing. They have a product that it's a larger population. They have an orphan designation or indication that they're willing to pursue now, but they're actually looking to hold off because they have a broader one in a few years, and it just doesn't make sense to launch now.
What it does, incentives are generally about the finances of drug development, and I get that, but this really undermines the power of science and what we know can benefit patients with rare diseases. It really yanks that away even more, and that's in my view, not okay.
Yeah, and there was another drug company last year that was working on a secondary use for an orphan drug, but it would have disqualified it from orphan status, as you were talking about earlier, and so they just stopped pursuing. They're like, well, we're just going to lose out. Like, it will be financially detrimental. We can't make money on it, and so they stopped. Can't justify it.
It's one more thing I wanted to say, just because I think you brought up such a good point on the ordering. I've heard criticisms from both sides of the aisle over the years around reported ways in which folks try to game the patent system. And they'll say, oh, people are very tricky about when they'll apply for certain patents. Now, look, a lot of that is patently unlawful because, the reality is, if you can't sit on some of this prior art for 10 years and then apply for it later, and candidly, you create a much riskier and much more volatile patent market if there are allegations of folks doing that. I would think if I were someone who felt that that was something that was already happening, I would imagine that this would increase those sorts of risks, and it would increase the need, frankly, for a lot more scrutiny and oversight with respect to patenting, when what I've always heard historically and what I believe is we want folks who discover an exciting new technology that's non-obvious and that is useful to apply for a patent as quickly as possible and to try to get that product through trials and to market to patients as quickly as possible. So I think even from folks who have been critical of what they view as some of the incentives within the current patent system or of potential gaming, I don't see how they would look at this and say, okay, this is a recipe for the type of rational patent system that we want to see and for, again, above board good behaviors. I expect most folks are always going to try to do the right thing, but we never want folks to sit on potential discoveries that are useful for patients or potential discoveries that are useful for patients. And I think it's a significant concern that that would even be a calculation that folks would have to make in this type of regime.
Yeah, and I think looking ahead and looking at the future, I want to ask this question to Amy. So what is the coalition you're working on, working with? Who's in the coalition? And can you tell us a little bit about the priorities, including like the Orphan Cures Act?
Sure. Thanks, Christina. So as Christina indicated, Leavitt Partners is managing a coalition or a task force, as we're calling it, the Save Rare Treatments Task Force, that is comprised of patient organizations, associations, as well as some industry partners that are, then this task force is focused exclusively on the orphan drug exclusion in the IRA and price negotiation there. It's we made a conscious decision to not call it an alliance because an alliance tends to take on a bigger whole umbrella of issues under a heading. There's a lot of other concerns about the IRA. There's a lot of support for the IRA. We are focused exclusively on the orphan drug exclusion and the potentially unintended negative consequences that it will have for people with rare diseases. We are, I'm happy to say, sitting here for the first time, that tomorrow the task force will be sending a letter of support to the co-sponsors in the Senate and the House, or the original sponsors in the Senate and the House, the legislation that is as narrowly tied to the concerns that this task force has with the Orphan Drug Act exclusion, that is narrowly tailored to exactly address the concerns that we're all talking about here. The legislation has been introduced in the House. The original sponsor was Representative Joyce from Pennsylvania and Nickel from North Carolina, but also has Representatives Davis, Hearn, Bilirakis, Peters, Gottheimer, and Smucker. And in the Senate, companion legislation is Barrasso and Carper. And we are very optimistic because this legislation in the House was originally introduced in September, in the Senate in October. And in these, can I say, busy times on the Hill, pick whatever word you want to use, we are pleased that there is bipartisan legislation that just addresses, go back 40 years, the Orphan Drug Act, someone had to say, oops, I think we didn't mean that part.
Yeah.
And that is what this task force is focused on. So both pieces of legislation address the provide for within the IRA now that a drug would remain excluded from drug price negotiation if it is approved exclusively for rare diseases. So that takes care of the Humira issue.
Exactly.
It also, the legislation, House and Senate, also provides that the clock, the tolling for when you get your 9, 13 years, 7, 11, depending on which one you're counting, would begin to toll at the date of approval of the first non-rare disease. So this is, again, a narrowly tailored task force that we think will solve this hugely important problem and benefit everyone and not undermine the main purposes of the IRA.
That's what I mean. That's the solution I like the best too, because I think it's not about. Yeah, there you go. The inflation. I mean, overall, it's a tweak. It's not throwing it out, which we could do too, but we won't. And because I think that there are the good parts of it, but that the idea that the clock's starting. Pascal, your CEO actually has done a great job. Pascal Surratt has done a wonderful job of articulating that. I think in the press, I've been really impressed with it.
Thank you. And go.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. I think I've read a lot of media articles about the orphan drug exclusion or the IRA and the program. And unfortunately, a lot of them reference the orphan drug exclusion. So one of our challenges is explaining to people, well, not so much. So it's really important for everyone here, anyone we talk to, when you talk to your investor friends, tell them to speak up,
Yes.
to make sure that we all understand that it may be on the list of exclusions that you already indicated, the limited exclusions, but they're there for the IRA, that the orphan one missed the mark. And it really isn't genuinely going to be, it can't be implemented as intended, in my view. But there is an education piece that has to happen here that the task force also will be taking on. Our savoritreatments.org website will also be available tomorrow. You can see I'm doing a shameless plug, but that's my job.
It's a good plug for patients.
Yep.
It is.
No, and I think, Amy, that's a great point to close on. Like, even though it was an exclusion, just like kind of you shared your story, the story of Frank, of the ODA passage, like there was amendments that need to be made. It wasn't really working as intended. And so thank you all to the panelists here today. It was super insightful, such a great discussion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.